If we can't die in behalf of progress, we can live for it. The way our fighting brothers and sisters looked at it, we're lucky. And they're right. We're lucky to be alive, but only if our lives make life itself worth dying for. Unless we put the gift of life to the hard employments of justice. If we waste that gift, we won't have anywhere to hide from the indignation of history. The morality of the auction block is out of date. There is no room in the American century for Jim Crow. I come in that boy's name and in the name of all who in this land of ours have no voice of their own. I come with a call for action. This is a time for it.
It shouldn't matter where you stand politically or culturally to realize that state power is so highly concentrated that it actively suppresses people's right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Power is so consolidated that officers of the law don't face consequences for misusing that power. There is no accountability for law enforcement, and that is what this movement is fighting for. Unrest in the past, like the 1968 Kerner Commission report, calls for this police demilitarization and reinstatement, which is exactly what the movement is asking for now. 52 years ago, it was the same analysis, the same recommendations, but no action came. One of the main points of this movement today is similar to the past, defunding the police. Now, before you leap to conclusions about the wording, hear me out. This is a good idea, but a bad slogan. Defunding the police isn't about dismantling law enforcement, but rather a redistribution of its funds. Black Lives Matter protesters are not terrorists. They're not trying to get rid of the police entirely, causing war and chaos. It's about reallocating some of the billions of dollars that gets put into law enforcement back into our communities. I believe a reallocation of even a small amount of their massive budget will help take a load off their backs. Police officers are overworked. They have so many jobs other than just enforcing the law. People call 911 to get their cats out of trees and to solve civil disputes. The idea of defunding the police is to reallocate some of their budget to other organizations that could do a lot more of the work police departments are burdened with. Instead of putting billions and billions of dollars into law enforcement, start putting some of it into social services, mental health, drug addiction, and even community-based programs of safety, support, and prevention. In New York City, the NYPD budget is $6 billion. In their annual budget cuts, the city cut the police department by 0.39%. This is a tiny sliver when compared to the Department of Youth and Community Development, which funds after-school programs, literary services, and even summer youth work programs. They're losing 32% of their budget. This budget of $6 billion in the New York City Police Department is currently more than the NYC's Department of Health, Department of Homeless Services, Department of Youth Services, and Department of Employment Services combined. Police departments get much more money when compared to other departments, and most of these departments' jobs help reduce the police workload. But because these departments are getting more and more money cut out of their budget, their workload is now the police's job to handle. Reallocating the police budget will make it so that police officers do more of the kinds of things they were trained for, which exposes and tackles the root of the problem. Making police officers less overworked give police officers less necessity and opportunity to use force. Jocko Willink, a retired Navy SEAL, explains this lack of police training in a Joe Rogan podcast.
And the way the police departments are set up, they do the most ridiculously minuscule amount of training for what their job is. So, as you know, I was in the SEAL teams. We would train for 18 months. 18 months we would train to go on a 6-month deployment. Cops, they get like 2 hours or 4 hours of combatives training a year. A year. That's complete insanity. It's complete insanity. Cops should train 1/5 of the time. 1/5 of the time you should be training, whether it's 2 hours a day, 4 times a week, or whether it's 1 day a week where you're going to go and you're going to go through scenarios. You're going to do combatives. You're going to work with simunition. You're going to do de-escalation drills.
Police officers aren't trained or equipped to handle so many of the situations they deal with, but don't be mad at them. Be mad at the system that in so many cases puts cops in situations where they're the only public resource within a community. A sociologist, Alex Vitale, professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, explains in an interview with The Atlantic that Policing is a tool of violence that has historically been used to facilitate gross inequalities and systems of exploitation. And so then to say that that tool is best suited to solve a broad range of community problems is misguided. The initial point of contact with the police is the beginning of our broken criminal justice system. Sure, police are unlikely alone to result in a conviction that leads to a prison sentence, but the presence of a criminal record itself is associated with the decisions to incarcerate for subsequent offenses. People of color are more likely to have a prior record, not because they are more likely to commit crime, but because of more engagement with law enforcement. But where do we even start to take any action? There are many obstacles to making any significant change. Police unions can stop mayors and police chiefs in their tracks for trying to implement anything new into a department. For example, Cleveland police were required to file a report for any time an officer unholstered and pointed his gun at someone. Union head Steve Loomis said it would make police officers scared to pull their guns because of the paperwork. Unions make it almost impossible to discipline officers for even minor mistakes. They also allow officers that have been fired to reapply and get their jobs back with a union contract. The federal government can bypass unions by calling for an investigation of the police department for a pattern of civil rights violations. This is called a consent decree. It requires institutional changes of a department that is overseen by the federal court. But when the government doesn't take any action, people can sue. In fact, there is about $1 billion that goes into misconduct civil suits against cops in a year, but they're usually impossible to win because cops often call on qualified immunity. This means officers could be immune from lawsuits unless their exact conduct has been ruled unconstitutional. It requires victims to identify earlier decision by the Supreme Court or federal court where the exact same conduct under the exact same circumstances is either illegal or unconstitutional. If there are none, the officer gets away with it. In the 1967 case of Pearson versus Ray, the Supreme Court introduced this qualified immunity. They promised it would not provide a license to lawless conduct, but it has. Police shouldn't have a way out of their crime. They shouldn't go to work knowing that if they overreact in a situation, nothing will happen to them, and that they won't be held accountable. Police should only use lethal force when they are in imminent danger. Not, they were reaching for something, not, I think they had a gun. You must be able to handle your fear. You cannot panic, and you cannot be biased. A cop's job isn't to be judge, jury, and executioner. Resisting arrest isn't grounds for murder. The disarray of the American police system stems from a lack of training and the powers and privileges they get with a badge. From there comes the brutality we see today. But in a majority of situations, police officers handle confrontations responsibly. That should in no way justify cases where police officers have misused and abused the law, and it's in those situations where the historical inequalities come into play.